Hi, students. Okay, so to understand Japanese literature and its transition from the late 1800s into the early kind of modern 20th century, the 1900s, we really have to understand the Japanese political system. Because, of course, we all know that politics and literature are inherently linked, indelibly so. So we start off the era that we're going to be looking at first, or era, I guess you guys would say, era, I say era, is the Edo period. So imagine it's Japan, it's 1603. We're not going back that far, but you can imagine. And it's pretty much a feudal system. So Japan is broken down into a series of feudal pieces of farmland, and they are basically run by a group called the Tokugawa. So the Tokugawa were established. They were a kind of group of feudal lords, and they were established by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1603. And this feudal period lasts all the way through to 1868. So if you think about that, that's an incredibly long time, over 300 years of a very kind of strict, somewhat constraining type of rule, I guess, in which people's place in the society in which they lived was dominated by how much land they had. So as predicted, this period was somewhat conservative, the Edo period. Of course, there were hints of scandal, things went on, but generally, literature of this period is known for being kind of, I don't want to say safe, but almost classic, as it were, Lots of focus was on kind of standard narration, naturalism, romance was a big feature of literature. You'd often kind of have very standard plots. Literature would be kind of didactic. It was designed to have a strong moral purpose to support the Edo codes. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this began to wear on people. People began to challenge this dominant era. And what you see coming next is, so the Meiji era, Emperor Meiji, in 1868, basically changes how Japanese literature is written. And the change obviously wasn't, it's not as if overnight literature changed, but you can see this gradual evolution. So the Meiji era was from 1868 to 1912. And you will see works published in this period that tend to be kind of between older conservative ideals and newer, modern, sometimes controversial themes and ideas. So, for example, Mori Ogai's The Dancing Girl, this is the first text we're going to be looking at, was published in 1890. Now, Ogai was a Japanese writer who, I think this story really contains some of the earlier romantic, classic styles of Japanese fiction. Of course, there are modern techniques, but generally it's, we have a bit of a controversial plot. So you can see these hints of more modern narrative fiction styles coming in. But for the most part, things were kind of conservative. We have a beginning and a middle and an end, a simple structure. And the characters aren't exactly three-dimensional in many ways. They're kind of often, I guess, their nationality or what they do. It's a very simplistic rendering, almost. Now, what started to happen is, as the Meiji era progressed, you would see things becoming even more kind of, I don't want to say liberal, but even more modern in thinking. Japan began increasingly with the Western world, and writers wanted to focus on this. They didn't really want to focus so much on classical Japanese modes of narration and literature. They wanted to focus on realism, which was kind of the big thing in Western literature at that time. Now, what you see is an extension of this come up later on with something called the I novel, which was a hyper-realist mode of narration. But that doesn't really come in until about 1907, and we're going to be looking at that in later weeks. But for now, you can start seeing the hints of this excessive realism in the short story Separate Ways, and this is by Higuchi Ichiyo. So Separate Ways is the next story that you're going to be reading this week. And she has actually been called the last woman writer of old Japan and the first of modernity. So you really get this sense of her story that she's crossing those periods. We're at the kind of crossover point from the late Meiji era and the early Taisho era. Now, the Taisho era, also known as the Taisho democracy, lasted from 1912 to 1926. And this era was completely modern, much more forward-thinking. The Meiji era was progressive, make no mistake. It was very modernist in its thinking, very westernized, lots of focus on technology and change and industrialization, globalization. But the Taisho era really kind of saw this take place on a bigger scale. Emperor Taisho was a kind of old, sickly man. He wasn't so interested in kind of reinforcing old ideals. He was actually interested in progress, and under him, a lot of his courtesans were able to pass a lot of laws that made the country far more liberal than it was before. We can see this in literature. So Ways by Higuchi Ichio really is the epitome of this literature at a crossroads. It's steeped in some of the older forms of classical modes of narration, but it also contains some of the forms of more modern realism. And also in its content, it's provocative. I mean, this is about a woman who decides to engage in she has a choice. Does she be a respectable woman making a living from sewing, but only just making a living? Or does she decide to go and be a courtesan, but in return be expected to give sexual favors? I'll let you find out what she chooses. But can you imagine, this content's controversial? You know, this wouldn't really have happened in the Edo period. But in the late Meiji and early Taisho era, this is a theme that can then be addressed. What we then see next, we see a wonderful show called The Tattooer. And this is by Janichiro Tanizaki. Now, Tanizaki was even more kind of progressive in his writing. His work really is representative of the incoming liberalism of the Taisho democracy. And The Tattooer is a really interesting story. I'll leave you to read it, but think when you read it about how the themes, the content, the method of narration, the characters, and just the overall philosophical and human self-related questions. Think about how these are very controversial and very modernist almost. So that's pretty much how to understand the eras. So Edo period, a little bit more conservative. Taisho era, very much a democracy. And then you've got the Meiji era in between, which is kind of that crossover era. It's worth noting that the tattooer is set not in the present day. So remember that. I'll let you figure out when it's set, and I'll be talking about that in the lecture. But I hope that gives you just an idea of how Japanese literature can be seen as evolving depending on the political constructs that were happening at the time.